So the importance of irrigation practices when growing in sustainable media, not something that we should overlook too much. There's all too many times that I go to growers and I'm saying to them, so have you checked your water at all since you've been on the nursery? And they're kind of like, no, never had it checked. And yet it's that one thing that we're putting onto our plants constantly. And if we're trying to grow some ericaceous crops that obviously don't like lots of calcium, magnesium, and then we've got some hard water, simple things that we should kind of just be looking at just to make sure that we know what our water's doing. So the number one concern I get from growers that are thinking about changing to sustainable growing media, it's all surrounded around watering. Sustainable growing media though, it doesn't use more water, and yet people think that it does. We just need to be thinking about how we deliver that water in the most efficient and effective way. I'm sure some of you are thinking, he doesn't know what he's talking about, where's he been for the last few years? But hopefully I'll try and explain. If we have a 2-litre plant growing in average weather conditions for June, whatever that may well be, and if we say a plant needs 30 litres of water a month to grow and survive, then that's how much water that plant needs. It's then just about how we deliver that water. So could we give the plant 30 litres of water once and leave it for the rest of the month? No. So could we give the plant 10 litres of water every 10 days? No, obvious. Could we give the plant 2 litres of water every other day? No. And yet, remember, there'll be people out there that are almost trying to do that currently because they've never checked actually how much water will be going onto their crop. So could we give the plant 1 litre of water every day? I sort of said maybe. I'd probably say it'd probably be a little bit high still, but we're getting closer to it, aren't we? And then could we give the plant half a litre of water twice a day? Yes. And therein lies the difference. If we go to above and we're trying to give it 2 litres of water every other day, then we're clearly going to be using more water. And that in turn then will leach out the very nutrients that we put in the growing media. The nitrogen especially, that's the first thing to disappear out the bottom of the pot. And if we haven't got it as a slow release or a controlled release, it may well be gone in a matter of days if we get this wrong. We know, as we spoke earlier, that peat-free growing media will arrive drier. Lots of advantages in that. We know that if it's drier, we can get more on our lorries, cheaper delivery costs. We know that also lower water content in there will also slow down some of that microbial action, some of the osmocote that will not release so fast. So we get slightly better storage times. Yes, it's never going to be as good as 100% peat, but at the same time, we don't want to move too far away and ruin some of our storage time by making it too wet to start with. So sometimes we need to be looking at, even from our bale breaker, maybe putting a watering bar on it, try and get some of the dust elements down that you can get from peat-free growing media. And there's a few options, that's simply in the back of a compost hopper that's feeding the growing media through into the potting machine. There's lots of options out there. Some of them may need to be bespoke depending on how you're doing it. But if we can get it right from the very beginning, that's certainly going to help. And then we also need to look at whether or not we've had the right irrigation. Maybe not 5 years ago, maybe not 10 years ago, but actually maybe if we had irrigation like this 30 years ago, was it ever actually that brilliant? Or was we in a time where we didn't worry about water so much? We was having peat-based growing media that held lots of water, very forgiving. So people have continued. And I actually took these photos on Monday morning. So these are the Pinjet type nozzles that have been around for a long time. And don't get me wrong, they do a job, but maybe now's the time to start thinking, I need to look other places. With this setup, they've had to have this release of the water afterwards, which obviously wastes the water that's in the pipes. Otherwise, the nozzles will drip constantly until the water has left the pipe. Also then when you turn it on, they tend to all start up at different times because the pressure's got to be built back up. And then you can get hard water build up around the nozzle, which then obviously in turn gives you an uneven water pattern. But there's also other things. There is a nozzle right in the middle of the shot, which all these nozzles are spaced correctly to give overlaps. But actually, where the pipe was cut, they never ended up having another one which would also throw back. So those Sonetti that are growing there were actually drier on the end, and they constantly have to top up the water on the end because they're missing a dripper. Some simple things, but maybe putting a nozzle at the end there, which was just doing a 180 just to improve the amount of water at the end, would be an option. If this customer complains about, the watering of peat-free growing media, then possibly they should already be looking and deciding whether it's correct. Can you imagine the water pattern that you get from that? So yeah, at some point, I suspect there's maybe that pipe's broken or something, someone's glued it back together wrong, or it was taken apart the other end and it's got a twist on it. And then they've got hooks that are hanging the pipe on it, and some of them have moved closer together and it was missing some, so now we're up and down. And bear in mind, these nozzles obviously throw a certain distance sideways and they'll be watering the bed next door. Well, where they're lower, they're not going to throw onto the bed next door. You might all have yours perfect, but it's worthwhile just double checking to make sure it's correct. And this is an example of bed edges. So you can see the bay next door was actually empty. So probably quite rightly, they turned that irrigation off, so they didn't waste the water going onto an empty bed. But that irrigation from that bed was actually watering the plants on the neighbouring bed. And so that is the consequence of not remembering about the overlaps, or indeed even setting up a system where it has overlaps. This is another old type of nozzle, puts on lots of water at a time, which again, maybe with peat-based growing media that wets up okay. Lots of water going on quickly can actually not be that good. So if you was watering with a hose pipe, you know yourself that you might water it, walk away, come back, water it again. You certainly don't just do like my example before, put 10 litres of water on your 2 litre pot and walk away. It's better done slower over longer periods of time. So having nozzles that are applying less water, but then leave them on for a longer period of time, it's going to help with that wetting up. And especially some of those bed edges that you get. If they are dry, you don't want to put only 10 minutes of water on and to see the first 9 minutes washing off. And then just as it's about to start taking up water, the irrigation's gone off, but the middle of the bed that was already wetted up as it should do. These also wear quite a lot, and it's quite often you go around and it's like they're not spinning correctly. It's like going like this or something like that. Again, going to create uneven water patterns. We need to think about how we deliver this water in the most efficient way. Let's think about different nozzle types for different situations. Some that might be good 30 years ago may not be the right way to go now. Sometimes the nursery changes. Sometimes people even make their beds wider and think they've done the right thing, but the irrigation was always set up to throw a certain distance, and now the bed edges are always drying out. Make sure the nozzles are working as they're meant to be, with the correct pattern. Are the irrigation nozzles the correct distance apart to give the right overlaps? That's kind of along their lengths. If you get to the end of the bed and you haven't got an extra one at the end of the bed, that's not going to be throwing back in, so you might need an extra one. Make sure the pressure output from pumps is correct. Nozzles need a specific pressure to create the right droplet size. If you've got too high a pressure, you might be producing too finer droplet, which might be more susceptible to being blown in the wind if it's an outside. I want to add there as well, just think about the cost of pumping water. Pumps are not cheap. If we've got an endless supply of water, maybe we might not be so worried, but just think, some pumps, 5, 6, 7, 8 kilowatt pumps, it's not cheap to pump water, even if you're not worried about wasting it. And then adding H2Grow liquid into your irrigation water, making it as effective as possible. One of the irrigation that I really like at the moment, and I used to use, are the MP rotators. They seem to work really well. They're less susceptible to wind, but really effective. You can get different sizes. They actually will go on the edge of a bed, so that actually you don't get no wastage. You're not watering roadways. They do 90 degrees, 180 degrees. You can really tailor them to your beds. I used to have separate taps on each one as well, so actually you can turn individual ones off, maybe turn the end off if there's no plants there. I suspect in this tunnel, from where those nozzles are at the top, I suspect the majority of it is going to hit the side of that polythene and run down the side. When we had lots of water, might not be a problem. Nurseries expand, peat-free growing media, we need to think about not wasting any of it. So really simply done. There is software that you can use to actually map it out. In some ways, yes, it's useful, but just doing this simply just to prove whether or not you're on the right tracks is good enough. So select a suitable area, that's really good, quite central in the tunnel. Check the irrigation quickly before you start to make sure there are no obvious problems. Lay out the catch containers, those little trays that you stand plants on, quite useful. And then run the irrigation for a suitable amount of time. Doesn't need to be 10 minutes, 20 minutes, just enough that you're going to be able to measure some of the content in the catchment trays. And then simply tip it into a measuring cylinder, and then hopefully it's all uniform, it's 100%, you're okay. Another thing that we need to be thinking about with irrigation, and that's certainly when we're starting off plants, peat may well have been very forgiving in times and helped us out a lot, whereas we need to be thinking more about how we're going to get these young, vulnerable crops established. And if you look on the left, that's quite common. Trays coming in, stood down on the bench. They'd been there about a week, those geraniums. And then, but on the very edge, on the right of that picture, on there, they started to dry out. So I pulled the plugs out. The plug on the top is much drier, slightly lighter in colour than that one on the top there, which was from the centre of the tray. If they're not watered before they're potted, because after all, it's a geranium, they don't need that much water, do they? That growing media could already be hydrophobic, not had any H2 Grow liquid applied to it. Why would it want to absorb water when it goes into your final container? Whereas the one in the middle already got some moisture in it. You put it into its final container, you do that final watering. The one in the middle there wets up as it should do. The one on the outside was dry even before it was potted, sits as a little dry island with all this lovely wet growing media around it with a wetting agent, and the plug is now dry. And the damage is done early on. You start to think after 3 or 4 weeks, bearing in mind that these will be spread throughout the bed. So now you've got uneven trays, you might end up having to make up trays. Little things can make big differences. Root loss early on, maybe a disease that gets in there early on, and then again, a few weeks later, you're thinking, why are these plants going backwards? And yet the damage was done before they even touched the new growing media. Another example of exactly what happens with young plants, not a very big capacity there for holding water at all, because obviously small little plugs. So let's start thinking, when did they have H2 Grow applied to them? Was it never? Because if it was, we should be thinking about treating that growing media as well as the growing media they're going into. When was they last fed? Another common scene, you get your plants in, you want them in a week beforehand, so make sure you're ready for your potting, and they sit there for a week. The young plant producer almost definitely was using a water-soluble fertiliser to feed these plugs. So we're already maybe a week without some. Then you think, actually, I'm not going to pot them this week. You end up potting them a week later, and now we're 2 weeks. Yes, we put our new young plant into our lovely growing media, where we put lots of fertiliser, and yet still the very plug is sat there with its roots still in its initial growing media with no fertiliser. Some of the good fertilisers to use at this point would be the Peter's Plant Starter. So it's quite unique in its analysis because it's a 10-52-10. I say it's like Red Bull for roots, and it's great to put it on early so we can actually stimulate some root growth and try and get these plants moving for when they're potted on. And also think, is this crop susceptible to any root diseases? Many of them are, and remember with peat-based growing media, much more forgiving with these situations. Maybe these are going to dry out once or twice more and cause a bit more stress. Is it the time to put in either a conventional chemistry early on to make sure that they're as clean as possible when they are potted? Bearing in mind this is the lowest volume you'd use it at that point across your young plants, as opposed to maybe when they're in an 8 centimetre or 10 centimetre pot. Much more cost at that point to apply corrective fungicides and things. Or is it a biopesticide, one of the biostimulants like Triboost? Might be best to put it in early. Knowing when to water is more important than ever. Andrew mentioned about looking at the top of the pot, and as I said right at the beginning of today, I said about the advantages of peat-free, so that we get less seeds, weed seeds growing, less moss, less liverwort, potentially even less water across the top, where some plants, like particularly like I suppose a cordyline that doesn't like sitting wet across the top, there's advantages. But it's not what you can see that matters, it's obviously what you can't see. So it's always important to actually get your pot out or plant out the pot and actually check just to make sure sometimes that you know that your irrigation cycles that you got it on is actually still performing correctly. We don't want to be in a position where we're thinking, it looks dry, let's just water it again. Because in that example there, and you can see it there, but if we go back, that's what it looked like on top. You could be thinking, that's dry, we'll put the irrigation on, you pull it out, and it doesn't need irrigating. We've saved that water that was all thinking that, you know, peat-free uses more water. We've saved the nutrition that we haven't leached. But bearing in mind, this wasn't just peat-free growing media, this is peat-free growing media with H2 Grow added to it. So this is helping move the moisture around in the pot. It doesn't just help with maximum water holding capacity, it will help move it around and keep it more even within the pot whilst it's growing. Lots of benefits from using H2 Grow. A lot of people don't realise quite how long these can last when you actually apply them at the full rate, so up to 12 months with one application. At the lowest constant use rate of 5 ml per 1,000 litres of water, so we're not talking about using lots, and one 5 litre bottle can treat 1 million litres of water. It goes a long, long way. And then hopefully we're going to see some improved water management in the pots and containers, and then effective re-wetting of that growing media, and it will maximise water holding capacity. Add in H2 Grow with our water-soluble fertilisers. I don't understand why people wouldn't add it in. We're paying a lot of money for water-soluble fertilisers. We certainly don't want to see it wasted. So why not add in H2 Grow liquid at that point? They go hand in hand. We make sure that when the water hits the growing media, it soaks up and we don't waste any of our precious water and water-soluble fertiliser. Add extra wetting agent, maximise irrigation efficiency. Use shorter, more frequent irrigation cycles to minimise that leaching. We can't put 2 litres of water on a 2 litre pot and think that we're going to be doing that plant any good. Monitor the pot moisture levels to manage irrigation effectively. Remember, growing media may appear dry on the top, but it will be moist enough throughout the rest of it. And then a thorough first couple of waterings is essential to ensure growing media is fully wetted up. So that's obviously a close-up of just where those roots are getting. Some people think that they may not spread where it's a bit drier, but that's why having a wetting agent in your growing media can help make sure that it's moving the water around as effectively as possible, so you don't get those dry pockets. Dry pockets tend to then lead to higher releases of osmocote in those areas and a higher EC, and even when they do wet back up, it's harder to get those roots back into those areas. Quick recap, make sure your young plants are fully watered before potting. Ideally add in H2 Grow liquid and a water-soluble fertiliser. I would suggest it should be Peter's plant starter. That's whether it's a plug plant, a liner, it can even be a 1 litre, 2 litre, whatever plant that's going in, but a feed of some description if it's had no controlled release fertiliser. A lot of people as well think we've got those old 2 litre, whatever crop they might be, and think they're getting a bit old, I'm going to pot them up. Typically they don't allow for the dilution from the fact that there's a 2 litre maybe going into a 5, so they started off with 4 kilograms of feed per cubic metre, but as soon as you put the 2 litre in the middle with no extra feed in it, it's obviously not got enough to get it started, and the dilution means that you're probably down to like nearer 3 kilograms. So test your irrigation and make sure it's working correctly. After potting, give a full watering to fully wet up the growing media. In hot conditions, plants may need watering soon after potting, and don't delay. I was always one saying to my potting team, don't bother watering them as you go, we'll just switch the irrigation on when you finish the tunnel. That may well have been fine when we was all peat-based. Wouldn't be the same message now we're peat-free. Subsequent waterings will require less water, so just make sure that it wasn't very much you tested how long that irrigation needed to be on in the fresh growing media. Make sure you're checking after you've watered it a few times, and then check actually how much water should I be putting on, how long should it be on for. because there is no way that if we had a peat-based growing media in a tunnel that had 10 minutes, there's no way a peat-free growing media in the same tunnel would still need 10 minutes. Just one last thing. Just think about if the irrigation on your nursery is up to scratch. Has your peat-based growing media been papering over the cracks? And could it be time to look again at the irrigation?